you all very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and share a few ideas with you. I think this is a very important organization, and I think you have a chance to genuinely help change American history. I like very much working with Alfredo Ortiz and Elaine Parker, and you may have noticed, by the way, I assume all of you have this, because they're pretty good at distributing things. And if you'll notice on the back, you can tell how committed I am, because it has a quote from Alfredo and me in favor of the American Small Business Prosperity Plan. I am convinced that we need concepts like freedom fighters on our side, people who are prepared to stand up and really make the case, and who are willing to take on the traditional power structures which have all grown much more destructive in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think in that sense, that what Job Creators Network does is extremely important. Remember, if you are a big government socialist, you hate small business because you want to group everybody into large structures. You want people to be used to think of themselves as a collective, not as individuals. And you want to be able to control things, and you control things easier if they're all big structures. So in a sense, just as Stalin and others hated the middle-class farmers in Ukraine and deliberately created a famine, the big government socialists in this country have an instinctive dislike for small business. And that's why you see all these regulations, all these laws, all these efforts at taxes, because in their ideal world, everyone would have to work for the government. In fact, if you'll notice, governments have been adding about 50,000 jobs a month, over the 600,000 jobs a year. So much of what Bidenomics is about is taking your money and your children's money, much of it borrowed, spending it on a $6 trillion, $200 billion budget, and hiring people who then become part of the machine and who, from their viewpoint, hopefully will vote for their reelection because that's their job. And the result is their model would be bigger and bigger government, higher and higher taxes, less and less individual liberty, so that everybody would get used to being part of a large group. That's why they also hated welfare reform when we passed it in 1996 and got a Democrat, Bill Clinton, to sign it, because welfare reform reestablished the priority of work, got people off of dependency, taught them how to earn a living, took millions of children out of poverty, largest single improvement in child poverty in American history. But all of that was irrelevant if you were a genuine socialist, because it meant their goal was to have people be dependent, not independent. Their goal was to have people look to the government, not to their own efforts. And they, frankly, have a deep belief that poor people shouldn't work because, by definition, since they're poor, we should be sympathetic to them, and so we should give them money so they don't have to work. And if that means they never establish the habits of work, that's fine if you're a big government socialist. The reason Job Creators Network matters so much is it actually stands for the core values that historically made America unique. It stands for the work ethic. We should, and the country, by the way, overwhelmingly believes this, that we should pass a bill that reestablishes for any able-bodied adult a work requirement for getting any money from the government. It's about a 76% issue. And I have to say, one of the things we have in common is John McLaughlin, who's here. And John does polling both for the Job Creators Network Foundation, and he does polling for the America's New Majority Project. And both the America's New Majority Project and Job Creators Network were inspired by Bernie Marcus, who has had an extraordinary post-CEO role in defending and creating understanding for the free market system. Now, what you really have today is a very strange environment in which you have, on the one hand, the country at large is remarkably conservative. For example, 84% of the country believes in parents' rights. But in the 11% are opposed to it and 7% don't have an opinion. But the 11% occupy what Lenin would have called the commanding heights. So in terms of the bureaucracy, the politicians, the Harvard faculty, the New York Times, that sliver all believe in a world that is repudiated by 8 out of every 10 Americans. But they have power. Now, what's happened over the last 25 years is they've gone further and further to the left. I'm actually writing a pretty long series of articles in the American Spectator trying to go back to the 1960s and show the growth of how we got to where we are today. And it's frankly very sobering. You know, we've gotten to a point where, and we've now seen it vividly, in 2 parallel developments that are going to be historic. One, when COVID led to schools putting the lessons online so people could see them, for the first time parents realized how radical the teachers had become. And the whole problem of dealing with radical education, which occurs in 2 forms. In many big cities, it occurs in the form of just pure incompetence. And in almost everywhere, it occurs in the form of brainwashing. So you end up, for example, with over half of the people under 25 thinking that Hamas is just fine, and that cutting off babies' heads is just a part of life, and therefore, you know, people should not be anti-Hamas. Now that's purely a function of the education system, which we pay for, and of teachers who, in my judgment, are crazy. I mean, this is not an ideological argument. If you think it's all right to cut off the head of a baby, you're nuts. You're a mental health problem. You're not a political choice. But that's the brainwashing half. The other half is pure incompetence. There are 5 high schools in Baltimore City in which not a single student, not one, can do math. And it's the 3rd or 4th most expensive school system in the country. And it just doesn't work. Oregon has responded to this challenge by adopting a law saying that you do not have to be able to do math or read or write in order to get a high school diploma. Because they're afraid that if you actually have a standard, some people will not be able to meet that standard, and that might be an ethnically inappropriate group, and therefore, in order to make sure that everybody can meet the standard, you don't have any standard. This is an entire state. Now, this is, in fact, in the long run, the end of American civilization if it continues. And we should understand that. We are faced with, I think, the greatest crisis since the Civil War. Is an internal crisis, which is the rise of a power structure deeply opposed to virtually every value that has classically been America. And there is foreign threats. I mean, all of us should be aware, and we should be much more serious about this, that nuclear war is not that far away. We have more and more countries with nuclear weapons. Several of them are clearly committed to using them. The Iranians would gladly swap Tehran for Tel Aviv. And this is a real danger. The North Koreans continue to accumulate nuclear weapons. There's an estimate by the end of the decade they'll have 300 nuclear weapons. And from their standpoint, South Korea may be a dramatically richer place, a dramatically more interesting place, but their answer would be to wipe it out. So you shouldn't kid yourself. I mean, it's not that Kim Jong-un is stupid. He represents a long-term dynastic desire to implement a totalitarian system on the entire peninsula. And he's gradually building the capability of doing it. So what we have today is an administration which has combined sleepwalking, cognitive challenges, and being totally out of touch with reality. I tell every audience, the best way to understand modern liberalism is to assume that they saw The Lion King and thought it was a documentary. And so they walk around and they say, lions and zebras sing and dance together. And you try to explain to them, no, lions eat zebras. And they go, didn't you see the movie? I mean, what's wrong with you? I just described the entire Harvard education system. And this is a crisis because people get acculturated into things that are crazy. In 1920, you could not have imagined the Holocaust. Even in 1930, you would not have expected the anti-Jewish, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, anti-communist, anti-children born with special needs. Remember, the Nazis actually started by killing children who had been born with various problems before they got around to killing Jews. You couldn't have imagined that in 1920. And by the time they were done brainwashing, most of the German population went along with it. It wasn't like there was this thin layer of Nazis. There were millions of people who thought it made sense to put Jews in a freight car and ship them to Auschwitz because it would cleanse the country. And in the process also get rid of gypsies and on occasion kill a bunch of Poles. These things happen gradually, incrementally. And one of the most important things the Job Creator Network is dedicated to is pointing out the failures. I know on a number of occasions, Alfredo sent me a note, and they put up something in Times Square that just drives the left crazy. And that's useful. In addition, I would suggest to you that for the new Speaker of the House, this is a pretty good core plan that he can pick up and he can implement. And in every single item in this plan, he will have the majority of Americans on his side. And therefore, I think it's vital. I want to say one more thing about foreign policy and then talk briefly about where Speaker Johnson is and then toss it open for questions if that's okay. On foreign policy, when you have the Vice President announce that they have a great new program on fighting Islamophobia at a time when the overwhelming threat in this country is anti-Semitism targeting Jews, you have an administration which is either insane or deliberately malicious. I think part of it is, frankly, that they're terrified that they're going to lose the Arab vote in places like Michigan. And so they are now, in fact, there's a commercial that one of the Democratic congresswomen put on yesterday that says flatly, if you keep supporting Israel, expect us to be against you in 2024. But then when you learn that the Vice President's stepdaughter has now raised $8 million for Hamas, you just understand there is a huge pro-terrorist wing of the Democratic Party that just shrugs it off. And I would also point out to you, because of television and because it was such a sudden shock, we are vividly aware of the barbarism of Hamas in the assault on Israel on October 8th. I would suggest to you that the Russians have committed 40 or 50 times more atrocities in Ukraine than Hamas has committed in Israel. But they're not on television. They're not organized for us mentally. This administration is afraid to make the Russians mad because they have 6,000 nuclear weapons. But if you want to talk about barbarism, virtually everything Hamas was doing in Israel, Russians have done in Ukraine. It is a stunningly barbaric situation. And I don't care whether you are for Ukraine or against Ukraine in terms of aid, but I'll tell you this, you had better be for defeating Russia. Because if we don't defeat Russia and Ukraine, we're going to be fighting them in Poland. And then we will be directly involved. And we will really be on the edge of a nuclear war. So this is not a war of choice. But if you don't stop Hamas and you don't stop Putin, the world will grow extraordinarily more dangerous. Now let me close with a brief reference to what I think has been a pretty good start. I'm a very strong supporter of Kevin McCarthy. I think what was done to him is a total outrage to have less than 4% of his conference join the Democrats to beat 96% of his conference. But we are where we are. I think after 3 weeks of floundering, they actually did a pretty good thing in picking Mike Johnson to be Speaker. I think so far he's very conservative, but he has a very pleasant and moderate tone. And therefore, the moderate members of the conference are comfortable that they can talk with him. The conservatives are comfortable he's going to be pretty tough and conservative. And I would hope that all of you would support this initial project of his. He did, I had written, I do a brief commercial. I do 3 newsletters and 3 podcasts a week that are free at Gingrich 360. And I had written that the Biden request for $106 billion in one bill was stupid because it's actually 5 different bills. It's aid for Taiwan and East Asia. It is aid for the border. It is aid for Israel. It's aid for Ukraine. And then it's a general aid package, or an aid package. And the fact is, each of these are separate topics. But if you are the old order, you like lumping them into one gigantic bill because then nobody knows what's in them. and then you get up for one vote. And that's the leadership, and this is why McConnell has always favored huge bills. The leadership can then dump a few $100 million here and a few $100 million there, and you'll never find it. And then 6 months from now, you'll learn you're just paying for something in Kentucky or something in New York that Schumer and McConnell wanted, because they were the last people in the room. When you break it down into 5 bills, it's harder to do that. Furthermore, Johnson had the courage to not only say, I'll bring up Israel first, knowing that the Senate leadership, not all the senators, but the Senate leadership would oppose him, and knowing that the White House would go nuts. But he also then did something very daring, which is exactly correct given the current budgetary situation. He said, we're going to offset it. If we're going to spend $14.5 billion over here, we're going to find $14.5 billion not to spend. Now, let me remind you, this is a budget of $6.2 trillion. That means an offset for Ukraine would require 1%. Now, when you're in a situation where, for example, the state of California lost $20 billion in unemployment compensation, stolen. And frankly, the US government should sue California. 19 billion of that was federal money. And they should sue California for incompetence. And I would say that you can go through the federal budget, having, as the only speaker in your lifetime to have balanced the budget for 4 straight times. I can tell you, you can go through that budget, you can find offsets over and over again. But somebody will squeal because it'll be their money. After all, think how bad the crooks in California would have felt if we had blocked them from stealing the $20 billion. And I think you can go through case after case. You have the mayors of the big cities now want $5 billion to take care of the illegal immigrants who shouldn't be here in the first place. So it's just a compounding effect. So I would hope all of you would encourage the congressmen and the senators, and the younger Republican senators seem to all be in favor of what Johnson's doing. But establishing the precedent that we take big single issue bills rather than gigantic complex bills, and that we actually pay for them, could be historic and could make him in the first weeks as Speaker a genuinely historic figure. And that's the kind of thing which the Job Creators Network does very, very well. So I do want to repeat, I really like working with Alfredo Ortiz, and I really like working with Elaine. And we all owe a debt of gratitude to Bernie Marcus because of his foresight. He both created the America's New Majority Project that we've been running since 2018 to find issues that are so big that we can win big victories. And, of course, he's been the inspiration for the Job Creators Network. And it's great.